Our reading today is from Jeremiah chapter 33, verses 14 through 16, found in the Old Testament, page 738 of your Pew Bible, if you'd like to follow along. The reading is about the righteous branch and the covenant with David. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will live in safety. And this is the name by which it will be called: the Lord is our righteousness. This is the word of the Lord.
Leon says New York is pretty different.
Oh, don't pay attention to Leon. He's never been anywhere. He doesn't have any feet. I've been to New York thousands of times.
Really? Mm-hmm. What's it like?
Well, there are some things you should know. First off, you see gum on the street, leave it there. It's not free candy.
Oh.
Second, there are like 30 Ray's pizzas. They all claim to be the original, but the real one's on 11th. And if you see a sign that says Peep Show, that doesn't mean that they're letting you look at presents before Christmas.
Can't wait to see my dad. We're gonna go ice skating and eat sugar plums.
Yeah, that's the other thing I wanted to talk to you about. You know, buddy, your father, well, he's on the naughty list.
You know, life seemed pretty good for Buddy the elf. Sure, he struggled to keep up with the pace relative to the other elves when it came to toy making, and yes, he was rather conspicuous, standing at about 6 feet 4 inches tall among his elfin peers who did well to be much taller than 4 feet. But Buddy the elf was genuinely liked. He felt encouraged. He had a home. He had a community that accepted him and appreciated him, whether it was because of or even in spite of his differences. And yet, something was still telling Buddy the elf that he wasn't like the other elves. His feelings are confirmed when overhearing 2 other elves mention that Buddy is in fact human. It is then that Papa Elf, who was played by Bob Newhart, explains to Buddy that he is the child of Susan Wells and Walter Hobbs. Susan put an infant Buddy up for adoption, and then she later, unknown the way to us, later passed away. And now living in New York City as a successful children's book publisher with his wife and his 11-year-old son, Walter was never even aware that Buddy had been born. As difficult as all of that news must have been to receive and to absorb for the doe-eyed and innocent Buddy, it was nothing compared to the news, that next bit of news that Santa had to share with Buddy, that his father, Walter, is on Santa's naughty list for being a very selfish man. Buddy sets out on a quest to find his real father, and he's determined, Buddy is determined that they will become a part of one another's life, that Buddy's ultimate goal is that of redemption, redeeming Walter, forever moving him from Santa's naughty list to the nice list. Redemption, restoration, hope. These are the opening themes of our Advent journey every year, and it is one of the reasons that we have chosen Elf as a modern lens through which to see and to experience these ancient and these universal themes. Yet in the same way, one cannot understand or appreciate light without experiencing darkness. In the same way, one cannot appreciate or experience hope without realizing in some way despair, without understanding you can't understand restoration without having been through or understanding some kind of brokenness. You can't understand or appreciate redemption without deterioration or even rejection. Whether spoken or unspoken, formalized or casual, there exists among people, among families, among communities, a covenant of understanding and expectation regarding how relationships work and flow and live. When expectations are not met, not lived up to fully, not lived into, there is deep hurt and pain. You saw in the clip the great hope in Buddy's face and in Buddy's voice, in Buddy's eyes of all the things he and Walter are going to do together once they are reunited as father and son. Buddy expects that upon arriving into New York, Walter will welcome him with open arms, be excited to learn he has another son, and their relationship will be as if decades had never passed. Our ideals expect parents to always without fail, to be welcoming and sympathetic and understanding and forgiving of children. Our ideals expect children to always be obedient, respectful, and courteous. Our ideals expect both children and parents to be kind and loving and grace-filled towards one another. These relationships are covenantal, whether they are spoken or unspoken. They are covenantal in nature. We hope and we want and we expect and we need parents to welcome their children unconditionally and love their children unconditionally. Yet we know that's not always the case. A daughter goes off to college in August. She was the cheerleader, the homecoming queen, beautiful long blonde hair, flawless skin, and she comes home at Christmas. Half her hair has been shaved off, and the other half that remains is now purple. Her arms are covered in tattoos, and the visible piercings alone would set off a metal detector at the airport. Mom and Dad, upon the daughter's return from college, are then faced with having a very difficult, awkward conversation about maybe asking her to stay home sick on Christmas Day, because they don't want to have that conversation with Grandma and Grandpa about what happened to her when she went off to college. How often do we hear on the news of adults violating that most sacred responsibility, keeping children safe? The stories of child abuse within faith communities, stories of sexual assault and harassment by clergy, the denials, the cover-ups, victimization of the innocent, exile, rejection. Engage in conversation sometime, will you? Engage in conversation with our LGBT brothers and sisters. And have them tell to you their stories of exile and rejection in those places. And those places one would assume would be filled with unconditional welcome and acceptance and love and approval, the church or at home. When these covenants are broken, it can lead to feelings of isolation, abandonment, and rejection. I know some of you may be sitting there thinking, boy, this took a really dark turn very quickly. But those first days and weeks of Advent generally are dark. They're dark because they have to be. They have to be dark in order for us to come to grips with our own circumstances and to come to grips with our own needs. Walter initially rejects Buddy as his son. And Buddy finds himself without a sense of identity, without a sense of home, without a sense of place. He can't return to the North Pole, the only home he's ever known, because he now knows the truth of who he really is. He's not an elf, he's a human misfit. And in New York, he has no sense of place. His father doesn't want a relationship with him. He doesn't. His job as a store elf isn't going very well at all. He lives with the mind and with the innocence of a 7-year-old child. Buddy finds himself in exile, a place of loneliness, a place of darkness, a place of rejection, which makes one wonder, can there ever possibly be a word of hope, a call for restoration, a move for redemption in the midst of rejection and exile? Rejection is one of the most common and painful of all human experiences. Each of us sitting here this morning have experienced rejection in some form or fashion. When a hope goes unfulfilled, when a hope goes unrealized. Not to give away the rest of the movie or the Advent season, I will simply say if there weren't a word of hope to be found, would any of us be here? The days are surely coming, says the Lord. The days are surely coming, when new life will spring forth, a righteous branch, and the promises once made shall be kept. The promises once made will finally be fulfilled. There is, in the midst of exile and loneliness and rejection, a glimmer of hope. These are the words of the prophet Jeremiah spoken to the Israelite people, who, as Josh has said, have had their world, their lives turned upside down. They have seen the temple, the center of their life and their community, destroyed. They have seen loved ones killed, murdered. They have been taken from their homeland, the only place they have ever known as home. They are living as exiled people. Their identity, which was once defined as God's chosen, now seems fragile at best. Isolation, no sense of home or place, rejection. Again, one of the most common of all human experiences, yet it is also an experience known to God. Because while Jeremiah is speaking to a people feeling as though they are rejected by God, they are blaming God for their being in exile, Jeremiah is also speaking on behalf of the one who has been rejected by the people. Whereas God's people feel as though it is God who has broken covenant. It really is the Israelite people who are on God's naughty list because they have broken covenant with God. Now, in human relationships, when two sides are feeling rejected and betrayed, there's often a standoff. This is how I feel. You rejected me. You didn't keep your promises. And the response from the other side goes, well, you rejected me first. You broke your promises to me first. And there's this back and forth of blame and a whole lot of projecting and no one taking responsibility. This is what I've heard anyway. I don't have any firsthand knowledge of any of this. I read about it, but I don't know firsthand about any of this. Not only does this create a stalemate in the relationship, it actually has the potential to cause harm, and hope can be lost in the midst of that rejection, in the midst of that tension, in the midst of that conflict. But thankfully, even when we are the ones who break covenant with God, individually or as a whole community of God's people, even when we are the ones projecting all of our stuff onto God, even when we are blaming God for the exile, for the rejection in our life, that our own actions have caused, thankfully we have a God who responds in hope by saying the days will surely come. The days will surely come. The days will surely come when rejection shall be seen as only a small part of the journey. And in time, God will keep God's promises. In time, rejection shall give way to restoration and redemption. One of the things that annoy me the most about Buddy the elf and people like him is also one of the very things I love so much about Buddy the elf and people like him. He's just so darn hopeful. He's so hopeful it makes you sick. He's so hopeful when on the surface he seems to have no reason to be whatsoever. As he's faced with obstacle after obstacle, reality after reality, rejection after rejection, there is still hope. There's still hope. The hope that once Christmas comes, everything will be okay. And even those like his dad, Walter, will experience transformation, will experience redemption, can be moved from God's naughty list to God's nice list. May it be so. May it be so.